So I wanted to share like the whole story of what's going on with my dad, starting with when we first started to notice symptoms. It came on very gradually. Like at the end of the year, my parents were planning a trip to come and visit us for Christmas. And I was chatting with my dad, and he was saying that he wanted to make kofta for us. And I was like, what's that? So we're talking about the recipe. It's this Middle Eastern food from Lebanon, and it's made with lamb and beef. And basically, it's kind of like their version of meatballs. Um, and you put parsley in it. But my dad was telling me all the ingredients, the spices, and he said parameters. And I'm like, that's not food. It was bizarre, and it was kind of like this little red flag that, like, oh, something's not right. Like, why would he call something parameters? And then he was kind of like a little confused, and he's like, oh wait, not parameters, what is that food? And he tried to describe it, and he's got me to understand that it was like an herb or a spice. And so then I was like, basil? Is it basil, Dad? Or is it oregano? Or is it parsley? He's like, oh, yes, parsley. But I'm not kidding when that is like the only thing I noticed. So then he comes to visit us, and we have a great visit. We go out to restaurants together. He plays his accordion for my kids. We play games. I mean, he's totally normal. Um, Walking, talking, breathing, and I don't remember specifically um, what he said when he was here visiting, but there were a couple of times where the conversation looped back, and he started the same conversation over like two times, where I was like, wait, we just talked about that. Huh. That's a little weird, but not anything beyond a little weird. But we started to notice little things like that maybe there's something funny going on. And so, like, all of the things we noticed had to do with like memory and vocabulary. And so we started to worry that maybe he was developing some sort of dementia or Alzheimer's, because his father had that, and it was like loss of words, right? And searching for words. Um, so that's where he was in December. Totally himself, totally normal, traveling, walking, eating, drinking, everything was like, the usual. And so he came to visit me, and then he drove to Virginia and visited my brother. He saw all of his grandchildren over Christmas, and it was a really long and kind of exhausting trip for them. They were gone for a week or two. And when they got back, he started to have an increase of symptoms, and he was more confused and forgetting more words. And my mom was like, okay, we really need to go see a neurologist and see what's going on with you. And she started the process of getting him in with a neurologist, and get the evaluation process. So, like, he had an initial visit and CAT scans ordered when one night in, let me see, it was February. So, February 9th or 10th, maybe. He came in to the room, I think at like 3 or 4 in the morning, confused, with like bleeding on his forehead. And my mom was alarmed and like, what happened? And he couldn't remember what happened, but he told her that he died, and or that he was almost dead, and he was super confused. And she was like, whoa, you're not okay, we're gonna go to the hospital. So she had a really hard time convincing him, but she got him in the car and took him to the hospital. And they spent a few days there and had to wait for the CAT scan, the MRI, and really didn't know what was going on until they saw the inside of his head, and they found a grapefruit sized brain tumor in his left temporal lobe. And then also one in his left frontal lobe that was about the size of a golf ball. So, like 1 inch and, oh gosh, 3 or 4 inches or so. So, big, big lesions in his brain. And based on the patterns of them, what they could see on the scans, they diagnosed him with glioblastoma. And it was big enough and in areas of the brain that made it inoperable and terminal. And they basically, within like 5 minutes, while they're at the hospital, they're like, something's wrong, what's wrong? He was not only diagnosed, but sent home to die. And the at that point, he was so confused that he did not understand his diagnosis. So the doctor was trying to tell him, you have brain cancer, you're going to die. And he was like asking irrelevant questions and trying to talk to the doctor about something that didn't make any sense. And so instead of telling my dad what's happening or trying to communicate with him, the doctor takes my mother out into the hallway, the busy hallway, standing up, people walking by, nurses, whatever, anybody can hear this conversation. And he informs her that her husband has terminal brain cancer, stage 4 glioblastoma, and that he is gonna die in a few weeks. I can't, like, whenever I think about that detail, I'm just so frustrated. Like, the doctor knew what news he was delivering to the patient's wife. Like, he could have had her sit down, treated her with a little more respect, given it the moment that it deserved. Like, why did he take her out into the hallway and make it seem like he was too busy to take the time to help her understand this diagnosis? Like, ugh. Anyway, they offered in hospital hospice care, but since there was really nothing that the hospital could offer to facilitate this process being any better than at home, my parents were like, let's get out of here. So they discharged my dad to hospice care. And because they discharged him from the hospital and my mom drove him home in the car, and because he didn't really understand what was going on, he thought he was better and that they sent him home to recover. And so when my brother and I came a day or two later to visit him, he was mad that we were there, and he was like, "No, I'm fine. I'm better. They sent me home. See, I'm better. Why is everybody making a big deal about this?" And he tried to kick out the hospice nurses when they came to meet him for the first time, and he's like, "No, go away. I don't need you." And like, he did not understand. Um and we tried to explain to him, and he's like, "No, I'm better. Like, I'm home. So there's nothing wrong with me." And he's like, I'm just forgetting I forget your name, but that's all. Like, he did, yeah. Anyway, so it was hard because we wanted to say goodbye to him, and he thought we were just there for a visit, and I stayed for 4 weeks and watched him slowly decline from being able to walk around and go outside and chat with people and eat and drink and all of those things to slowly losing all of those abilities, gradually losing vision, having a really hard time with understanding the perception of where things are. He'd reach out for something and it was actually 3 or 4 inches over from where it was. He could only see out of one eye. If he covered one, then he could see out of the other. He needed us to sit in very specific places. It was like he had like a very small window of what he could actually see. So if we sat straight across from him, they could see, but if we were over there, he had no idea that we were there. So his peripheral vision um, went away, and sometimes he seemed like he was losing his hearing, but then sometimes his hearing was augmented and he could hear every little sound. Um, and and throughout, he seemed to be able to have cohesive thoughts, and he tried to communicate, but his vocabulary diminished and is gradually getting worse and worse and worse. So one of my favorite memories from those early days when we were first there to spend time with him was he was still able to go out and do little field trips and stuff. So we went to the wildlife refuge and we were looking at birds, and he kept calling them people. And he's like, "Look at those people over there." He'd point to the ducks, and we'd talk about what kind of ducks they were and count how many there were. And then he'd see them again, as because we're driving through this wildlife preserve, and we'd go around a corner and we'd see the same ducks we had just looked at, but from a different perspective. And they were new to him. He didn't understand that it was the same. He's, "Oh, look at those people over there." And so all mammals, animals, they were all people. His specific nouns were some of the first things to go away. So his own name, the classification of animals, names of food, names of anything that's a noun, he just didn't have access to. That was one of the first things the tumor sort of swallowed up. So he has a lot of pronouns, and he would use it and those and this and people, and very general classification words to describe what he's trying to talk about. And then, like, my brother and I was the one who had four, because I have four kids, and my brother's the one who had six. And he would talk about us like with numbers to refer to us. Couldn't remember our names or our kids' names, but he did know that he had children and grandchildren and how many he had, and he remembered who they were when we called and chatted with him and stuff. It was very interesting to see what he did know and what he couldn't remember anymore, and slow decline. Anyway, the right side of his body stopped working. So his right foot dragged as he walked, and then one day he just wasn't able to pick it up anymore. And his nurse thought he was paralyzed. He couldn't really pick up his right hand anymore, his right arm, or his right foot. And at that point, we kind of thought he was stuck in bed. But then, a couple days later, he started moving them again, and he started walking again. So it was really kind of an up and down kind of journey. Some days he'd be able to move his right arm, and some days he wouldn't. Um, and then after about 4 weeks, my mom sent me back home to get back to my kids and my life, because it was taking longer than we expected. And she had all of the caretakers in place. She had lots of help and support. And um, so I came back home, and it has been so hard to be removed from the situation, because they live like 12 hours away. And so I can't just like pop in and visit. It's a plane trip, or a road trip that takes a few days. Anyway, so now we're just kind of checking on each other every day and calling every day since I've left. We've been back to visit again. I've taken my kids over their spring break to say goodbye and to help take care of him. And it was really sweet for them to be able to, feed him some food and help care for him, and see and kind of process and understand that he's not well, he's not doing well, he's dying. And they got to cry and hold his hand and say goodbye. Um, and so that was really sweet and nice and hard. Not your typical spring break activity. But anyway, at this point, we're just waiting. But since then, he's developed vertigo. So every time he rolls over to the right side, he feels like he's falling off a cliff. And he doesn't remember that that's the case. And so he keeps rolling over and screaming because he thinks he's falling off the bed. And that's hard. And some days he has the strength to move his body, some days he doesn't. He's been in bed for about a month, sleeping for about a month. I would say most days he sleeps 23 and a half hours a day. I mean, he's pretty much asleep, but he'll wake up for 5 minutes or 2 minutes to change, to ask for a little bit to eat. He can't swallow anymore water, but he can swallow like thicker things, so they have to thicken everything. And he's just eating simple things like cottage cheese or applesauce or soup or something like that. But he's still breathing, and so his brain tumor hasn't stopped his ability to breathe, and it hasn't stopped his heart yet. Um, So his body's still alive, but we're just slowly watching him disappear mentally and physically and